Hello everyone and welcome to the 18th and last video of the Learn HTML series. In this last video about HTML, we are going to learn how to display a form on our web page. This way we can have some user input. Let's start by opening our template file in our text editor. So here I have the template file. Let's not open it in the browser but open it with Notepad like this. Here we go. So an HTML form is used to collect user input. The user input is most often sent to a server for processing. The processing part is for another time, as we need other languages to do that. So we can only focus on the display of a form in this video. The HTML form element is used to create an HTML form for user input. So we do this by defining a form inside our HTML code like this. And inside our form, we can put in input elements. So the form element is a container for different types of input elements, such as text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, submit buttons, etc. We're going to implement the most used ones. The HTML input element is the most used form element. So an input element can be displayed in many ways, depending on the type attribute. So the input type equals text defines a single line input field for text input. Let's create this. So we have an input, then we have the type attribute, and let's say this is a text input, and we can close it like this. So there's only an opening tag and there doesn't need to be a closing tag. If we save this file as form.html and see it in the browser, we can see an input text field where we can put in some text. Okay, great. We can also add a label to our input element by doing this. We can do label. This has to be closed. And inside the label, we can say, for example, first name. We have to define that it is for name. And to create a link with the for attribute to our input element, we have to set an ID. So ID equals name. So this needs to be the same. The label tag defines a label for many form elements. So the label element is useful for screen reader users because a screen reader will read out loud the label when the user focuses on the input element. The label element can also help users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions, such as radio buttons or checkboxes, because when the user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the radio button or checkbox. So the for attribute, as I've said, of the label tag should be equal to the ID attribute of the input element to bind them together. Now let's see another input type, the radio input buttons. So we can define it by using the type radio to define a radio button, and radio buttons let the user select one of a limited number of choices. So let's create one. Input, just like before, then type equals radio. Let's give it an ID of skills. Let's close it. Let's also give it a label. For skills. Let's close it. And let's call it my skills. like this. So now we have our first radio selection, and let's say that this value is equals to HTML. So I'm actually a bit wrong here. This needs to be also HTML, and this needs to be HTML, also HTML. And let's create another option. Let's say that this is CSS, the CSS, then the ID equals CSS, and the value equals CSS. So we have two radio buttons, each with a value of HTML and CSS. So when we save this file and reload it in the browser, so we have our label first name with our text input, and we have also a radio button. So notice that each input field must have a name attribute to be submitted. If the name attribute is omitted, the value of the input field will not be sent at all. The input type equals submit defines a button for submitting the form data to a form handler. So the form handler is typically a file on the server with a script for processing input data. The form handler is specified in the form's action attribute. So we can define it like this. Action equals ... because we don't have this. In HTML, we don't have it. But we can define the button. So we do it like this. Input type equals submit. And value equals, let's say, also submit. Let's close it. Now if we save the file and reload, we can now see that we have a submit button. If we click on it, there will be an error, and this is because we have no server-side code like JavaScript, for example. We only use HTML. So there are a lot of more input element types, but this will give you the basic knowledge to implement a form in your web page. So we're now able to create a form with different input elements. So we can have some input from the user. We now have a basic understanding of HTML because we've completed this tutorial series. So we are good enough to create our own web pages. Now, to style our web pages, we need to make use of another language called CSS, which you can learn in another tutorial. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next tutorial series.